Woken up? Yes. Libido, sex, the wonderful subject of sex.
Haven't been brave enough to venture that one, so it's very good.
Oh, I'm sorry for you, Marion. Your life must have been quite barren.
No, we're waiting for the right person, and you're it.
Oh, gee, thank you. Yeah, everyone knows about the 16-year-old who had their brain injury and suddenly wanted to hump everything in sight. And this is the kind of myth that people see about someone who's had a brain injury, that you lose all inhibitions, you become impulsive, you do all sorts of inappropriate stuff. Now that does happen. That 16.
Isn't it just 16-year-olds in general?
Well, no, this is 16-year-old plus. Yeah, that's right. The problem is for the 16-year-old is they have their brain injury at 16, they never grow out of 16, and it's there at 60, and next thing you know, they're sitting outside girls' schools at sort of 3:30 in the afternoon, and the police are being called. But the common consequence of brain injury, in fact, is that your libido drops. You lose interest. Either because you're just too tired to be bothered, or you actually just lose interest. That whole part of your life collapses, it disappears, it goes, and that can become a major issue. If you're in a relationship and your partner suddenly thinks, well, don't you care about me anymore? Why aren't you interested? Here I'm doing all these things to help you. I'm putting all this effort into help, and all you're doing is ignoring me. What's going on? And that can become a major factor. It's more of an issue in younger relationships. It does occur occasionally in older relationships. Older relationships, people have often got other ways of getting on, and can, though often aren't, better at talking about intimacy and other ways of obtaining some sort of comfort and closeness. But if you're young and it's an important part of your life, then there can be major issues. For some people, it's a great sense of relief. Oh, thank God he's not trying to jump on me every 5 minutes now. And I can relax a bit and look after the kids because I'm too knackered to really worry about it anyway. So that's important to see that as an issue, and it's something that's always important to discuss and talk about, because it can impact very much on what goes on in relationships. And paraphilias, changes in sexual preferences, function, that does happen. Some people start losing a sense of what's right, what's wrong, and in particular, if previously maybe had some fetish or some particular desire to do something that you've contained because your partner doesn't like it, and you have a brain injury, and that back up and think about it and collect a bit more information stops working as well, or your ability to self-reflect, to be self-aware goes a bit, then you start giving in to those urges and things, and you start pushing stuff, and you don't read that the other person's getting a bit pissed off with you and they don't like it, and that can be a major factor as well. So you need to look at all those things and be willing to have that kind of discussion as well. And again, you've got to be able to talk in words of one syllable about what's right, what's wrong, what other people want. Sexual function is something that should be going on between two people in a mutual way, or three if that's what turns you on. But whatever, it's still got to be mutually acceptable to people. And so if you have a lost capacity to read other people, to know what's going on, to not automatically pick up on things, that can be a problem. And it's where you have to help partners sometimes to say, no, this is the way I want it, this is how it should be, this is what I'm feeling, and this is what I want you to do or not do, and as the case may be. And so people sometimes have to be helped to do that stuff.
Can I ask?
Yep.
What does the marijuana leaf have to do with it?
Absolutely. No, that was the only relevant picture I could find. I'm sorry.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was just wondering if it had any relevance.
No. Actually, it's what the weed did to their libido. And the same thing with partner change, because again, if you're impulsive, if you don't stop and think, you lose the sense of how you can affiliate with someone or what happens to hurt someone, and sometimes you can go off and engage in other relationships, and that becomes obviously destructive. So again, it's a matter of understanding these things and looking at the origins there. Yeah, he's not just a bastard and going off and screwing whoever. He actually doesn't recognise that this is a bad thing to do, and this is why it happens. And we need to stop and talk about those processes. Again, attention. Now that's an important one. Sex as well. What happens if you're halfway through and suddenly your mind drifts off somewhere else and you start thinking about something else? That can put your partner off a bit as well. That whole issue of attention. So remember, attention is something that's designed to keep us alive. When our primitive predecessors in East Africa were wandering up to that tree with all that lovely ripe fruit on it, they had to be able to concentrate on the fruit, but they also had to concentrate on what was going on around them as well, just to make sure there wasn't something hiding behind the tree that was going to happen for dinner. And that's where the salience network looks and triggers that system. There are, broadly speaking, two kinds of attention. And ivory tower academics will tell you there are heaps of different things, but really there are two different sorts. One is orienting attention. So if a truck was coming through the car park there cleaning out cars, our brains would orientate to that before we even knew there was a truck coming through. It just happened on autopilot. We couldn't stop ourselves doing it. And that's largely a right-sided brain function. If our brain then says, it's coming there, it might be coming through that window soon, do I get out there, do I hide over here, do I what do I do while I'm keeping on? So you've got to keep an eye on it and work out your escape route, think what else is going on. So you've got to hold two things in your mind at least at the same time. That's cells in this outer front curve of the brain that have to activate. And virtually everyone who's had a brain injury has a disruption in that system. Partially because the input to those systems get damaged, partially because the chemicals that are tied up with releasing transmitters in that system get damaged, partially because of that salience network that we talked about before gets impaired, and that also puts a large chunk of input into these cells to trigger things. Now if you look at our brains, most of the time we're just sitting around, we're doing our daydreaming, thumb twiddling, whatever we're doing stuff. That's a network in the brain called the default network that's functioning. If something comes along, bang, that triggers, then our salience network gets activated and we switch from default to salience network, because that says, this is something, let's do it. Is it relevant? Okay, that's relevant. Okay, now let's trigger that attention network and I can lock onto that and hold with it. So that ability then in functional terms allows you to divide and alternate attention. You can hold focus on something in spite of competing stimuli. Now what happens if you have your brain injury, but it's your job to go down to Pack and Save on a Saturday morning to do the supermarket shopping? What do you like when it's hot and cold running mums and screaming kids and trolleys and stuff, and Pack and Save, there's those narrow shelves, great big high stuff, and you forgot your list and you're not sure what you want to get and you have to do that. What does that do to someone who's had a brain injury, who's got attentional problems? It's not surprising that sometimes they punch someone in the nose, because you just get totally overwhelmed and you can't manage it. And
just get a countdown and avoid a lot of the whole hassle of Pack and Save.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and you go to countdown at sort of 10:30 on a Tuesday morning, or right. Yeah. So if that's a problem, roles change. There are things you can't do. If you're talking to someone, your partner, your kids, and they realise halfway through the sentence you're off looking somewhere else, you're thinking about something else, they're going to very quickly feel that they're not important, that they're being ignored. And they might be being ignored, but more likely than not it's because your brain hasn't been able to hold focus. That seagull going past the window has taken your attention. Or that thought that came into you, that's what I meant to do that. You can do one, you can do the other. You can't do that. Now this can also affect your memory. If you can think, I've got to remember this, there's a distraction at the same time. It's often a random process as to which one hits the memory banks. It might be something important that you had to remember, but it might be the thing that had no importance at all. What you actually had to get down to the supermarket or the dairy or what have you is completely gone. Or that you were supposed to pick the kids up from school today. It's your turn. So again, becomes disrupted. You lose that sense of importance in the role. People feel that they're being ignored, or you're not taking them seriously, or you're just suddenly becoming selfish and drifting off and doing your own thing, and you don't care about them anymore. And that becomes a common discussion when relationships break down. People sense that nothing's happening. So, can you manage sequences? You send someone out to, can you go and do this, and then do that, and then do that? And you go home, you get back, and you go, so I got the stuff at the dairy, but what about that and that I also told you to do? Oh, right, so you can do one thing in a sequence, usually the first thing, the last thing, but the rest disappear. So you learn to write things down, because otherwise you're going to get pissed off with things not being done. And again, if your partner doesn't know this, then they're going to be constantly disappointed. They're just going to constantly read you as if you're not interested, rather than you can't. It's more you can't. It's not that you won't, it's that you can't. So that's important. And again, just the same thing with task completion, for exactly the same reasons that changes, so stuff doesn't finish. What about affect? Mood? Emotions? So there can be alterations in how we experience mood, how we express it, or how we judge it. So, if you're looking at experience, the standard things, am I depressed? In depression, I was talking to someone while we're having a break. Depression is amazingly common after brain injury. At least 50% of people who've had a brain injury get depressed. Some studies go as high as 77%. And if you're depressed, so you have all your issues with brain injury, and then suddenly you become more withdrawn and you don't want to eat, and your concentration gets even worse and you get more grumpy and irritable and so on, then that's going to impact on things. Your libido drops away even further if there was any there. Rarely people can get manic, so if you damage the right frontal bit of your brain, you can be more likely to have hypomanic episodes and present with things that are pretty much a form of bipolar disorder. So that can happen. Anxiety is ubiquitous. Virtually everyone who's had a brain injury, except that little subgroup that have really severe frontal things, and so they don't know that they don't know. People get anxious because you can't do the stuff you did before. There's a lot to be anxious about when you had a brain injury. So how do you deal with that? And that's really important, because anxiety means your cognition's even worse. The more anxious you get, the harder it is to focus, the harder it is to concentrate, the more likely you are to be impulsive and do silly things, and that drops off. So what does that do when you're talking to someone? And if you, as someone's partner or parent or child, talk to the injured person and you do it in a way that they can't process what's going on, what's going to happen? Same for any of us. You get uptight, you get pissed off, you get, you don't know. And if your reaction is the impulsive one because your salience network's not working properly, then you've suddenly not just got anxiety, but you've got a whole set of secondary processes going on that impact on how you're interacting with other people, on relationships. So, PTSD. And some people still, regrettably, say that you can't have PTSD because you didn't remember the injuring event. There's a hell of a lot of stuff that's life-threatening and feels horrible just having a brain injury, and even if you didn't remember the bang, you may remember the lights of the Big Mac truck coming at you, you may remember waking up in the hospital bed with tubes everywhere, you may remember that suddenly you couldn't do the things you used to do and that life feels like crap and that you've lost complete and utter control. The reality is about a third of people who've had a brain injury get PTSD. And a lot of PTSD symptoms, because we know from the PTSD literature, really is the same as that loss of connection and overlap that in the salience network. And that's what we've seen, the people that had just PTSD and not brain injury. But again, the signature injury from the whole Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts is a combination of mild traumatic brain injury and PTSD. There's a big literature about that now. A lot of people there had blast injuries from IEDs, improvised explosive devices. You know, you put the pipe, dig the pipe into the side of the road, put an inverted copper cone in there and pile the explosive behind that, and that would, you know, then you'd ignite it and that would explode, the copper would invert and come out as molten copper combined with the blast wave, and you'd get the blast wave injury, and sometimes the molten copper would hit you as well. So it's a whole lot of stuff there. What about expression? How we express emotion is important. Yeah, there are sort of kind of recognised ways that are acceptable to say what we feel and express our happiness, our sadness, our anxiety, our anger, what have you. One thing that's quite common with expression problems is that people struggle with the amplitude, the amount of modulation. So you're presenting exactly the right emotion for the event, but you just don't have the right amount of it. You're just a little bit ticked off. You're coming across as if you're severely pissed off. You feel just a little bit sad, there's florid tears, and you feel really incredibly, terribly miserable. Yeah, so it's exactly the right emotion, but just the wrong amount for the situation. And again, you need to be able to read that and look at that and help the person to come back and talk through that, because if you don't do that, then you're sometimes misreading what's going on. You see someone as more distressed, as more angry, as more happy, or more whatever than they actually are. And that's where you need to have a conversation. You need to actually talk through and say, this is what you're showing me. How are you actually feeling? What's going on? What's triggered that? How does that work? You can sometimes react. A situation where you might just bite your tongue and sit on something. You can't stop yourself. So the emotion that would normally just keep buried inside ourselves because we don't want other people to know what it is we're thinking or feeling, you might just, bang, have that come out. You lose the capacity to restrain that. So it's a form of impulse control disorder. So again, the right emotion, but expressed at the wrong time or not in a way that you might ideally have expressed it. And that can impact. Yeah, you might want to tell the boss to piss off frequently, but sometimes it's not a good idea to do so. Lots of people have lost their jobs after brain injury because the boss or their workmates have just got annoyed with them for saying stuff that normally would just sit on. We also lose the ability to habituate, to sort of develop a habit around how we respond to things. So typically if something goes on, you learn to react to it. So you walk around the corner of a building in outback Australia and you discover you're 10 feet in the air and 10 feet away. And you come back down to earth and you realise it was just the hose rolled up, it wasn't a King Brown after all. And that's fine. You've done the appropriate thing. You've learned, you know it, you understand that, and that's what we all do. I've done just that sort of thing in Australia. But normally you'd walk around that same building half a dozen times, and by that time you've done that, you won't even see the hose unless it starts moving all of a sudden, because your brain has habituated to that, you've developed a response. If the salience network, which should be telling us that, is this relevant to me or not, isn't working, then you lose the ability to that. So every time you jump, and you keep on jumping, so people come close to you, someone's suddenly in your space, you haven't seen them coming. You normally say, oh yeah, you're there again. If you keep on jumping, then if someone's a surprise to you every time they turn up, that can impact on what they feel about you. You're expecting me, and they get a bit ticked off after a while that you lose that sort of sense of familiarity that should develop. So again, it impacts on how you can form friendships, how you can relate to other people generally, and it's part of the process that isolates you. And again, the congruence though, is it the right emotion for the trigger? And again, this is a Don Stuss one. He did a lot of early work back in the 1980s with research showing people pictures and then having a smiley face or a sad face or a neutral face and saying, okay, which face matches this picture? And one person that he got to put up a picture of a funeral. There was a coffin was going into the ground, and said, well, what face suits that? And he said, a happy face. And yeah, they did the right thing. They talked, and they didn't just take that and do it. They said, well, yeah, this is a funeral. Normally people think it's a sad thing. Yeah, you've got a happy face. Why are you happy? Not me in the coffin. So it's, yeah, but looking at that, and again, with that significant frontal system damage, sometimes you get those strange and weird associations that other people don't get. You know, the person who laughs at the funeral. And sometimes, yeah, it's just, they know they're sad, they know they should be sad, but they laugh, they can't stop themselves. Or other situations like that. And then there's that whole judgment, the perception and interpretation of what's going on. So do you read the emotional response in someone else? What do they actually mean? You know, are they showing this to me or not? You know, is Mum really pissed off? Is she really telling me that if I get off my Lego now, I'm going to get my tea in the bedroom and miss out on my iPad for the next week? Because that can be a problem if you don't get those things sorted out. Is that person in the pub just having a friendly banter with me and just having a joke and just being an ordinary bloke? Or is he actually taking the piss? Do I want to actually go and have a beer with him, or do I want to punch him in the nose? And if you can't read that stuff, that impacts on how you can form those sorts of relationships and those interactions as well. So it becomes a really major issue around social interaction, social function. Apathy. Yeah. How's people feeling at 25 to 5 on a Thursday afternoon? A bit like that, with me rabbiting on. It's interesting, if you look at the dementia literature, the single most annoying thing for caregivers as someone with dementia is apathy. It's not all the other things you might imagine, it's simply apathy. They don't do anything. They just follow me around all day saying, but they don't actually do anything. And what is apathy? Well, you can break it down really, I think, into 3 different areas, because these are different pathways in the brain. There's the whole issue of motivation. When I use the term motivation, I'm talking about the ability to generate an idea about what to do. So you've got to focus on it. You've got to have your attentional pathways, and it's up in this outer front curve of the brain. Then, stare, I'm focused on, hey, this is what I've got to do. So, but having got that idea, you've got to put it into action. You've got to get off your chuff and get on and do something about it. It's a separate pathway in the inner front bit of the brain. That's got to do with, does my brain think this has any potential reward or not? Is this going to be good or bad? But there's no reward in it. There's nothing in that for me. Why should I do it? And then the last thing is, do I have enough energy, enough drive, enough of that force to actually complete it once I've started? And that's more of a whole brain function. So you get some people who have problems right across the board with all that. But the commonest one is actually a problem with initiation. So it's very common that people will, I know what I've got to do, just doesn't get done. And again, in a situation, a relationship and an interaction with people, where you've got responsibilities, where you're given tasks to do, and you can't complete them because of initiation, that can seriously impact on that. I only told you to unstack the dishwasher and get the rubbish out before I got home, and she gets home from work and he hasn't done it. So she's going to get a bit ticked off with him, because this wasn't a hell of a lot to ask. And says, well, you're supposed to, I was going to put out the rubbish, and I'm getting around to it. But it still hasn't happened. So that, becomes a really important thing to manage. It's one of the simple things that you can usually manage. And again, it's a combination of pills and potions, pathways that use dopamine that are important for that. you use things that boost dopamine. Remember, you're not suppressing symptoms, you're boosting brain systems that you can make a good intelligent guess being damaged. But then there's a training effect. Okay, I'm going to sit down with the occupational therapist and we're going to take you through this step by step by step. We're going to break it down into as many steps as it takes for you to get a handle on what has to be done. And hopefully ACC is going to pay for that, for the OT to be here long enough to keep on doing that stuff and managing that stuff and until that's become a habit. And remember, if you've had a brain injury, you can develop habits. It's just going to take you longer than it took before you had your brain injury. So you can't just run, this is how long it takes a normal person to do it. You've got to allow the time it takes that person to do it.
In that context, you mentioned several times autopilot. I understand with a lot of brain injury that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, you lose some of that automatic capacity. Yeah. Remember when I said that, when we do stuff on autopilot, before your injury it's about 97, 98% of what we do is probably autopilot. But it's only when things become complex or novel that you think and you organise and you structure things. When you've had an injury, that level at which things become complex is so much lower that a lot of that autopilot stuff does get lost for that reason. Yeah.
And also when people said, I showed you whatever 10 times, now you can do it on your own. That's not the case either.
Aristotle about 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece said, what we learn by doing. And he may not have understood the neurobiology of that, but he sure as heck understood the practicalities of it. You don't learn by talking about something. If you had a brain injury, you especially don't learn by talking about something. You learn by doing it. And you go through, and there's a technique called errorless learning, which Barbara Wilson in Oxford especially talked about. And it's essentially, you look at what you've got to do with the task, you break it down into whatever steps is manageable to the person, and you do it step by step, but you only do it at a pace that you know you can do it perfectly. So you do it and you complete it to perfection, and you keep on doing that, and you gradually build up the pace, and you gradually combine until you've got it off pace. And that just has to take as long as it takes. Yeah, you can't set a timetable for that. For some people it's going to be quick, for some people it's going to be a lot longer, but you don't know until you start.
Yeah, but I also find then when you've not done it for a while, it's lost.
Yes, so you have to keep practicing, and you have to keep having top-ups, and you have to keep on having reminders, don't you?
Yeah, but employers aren't very, understanding of that.
Yeah, I know, and that's why there should be an awful lot more work with ACC case managers to get good occupational therapists who understand brain injury alongside people, alongside employers, get them back into the workplace, train them up while you're still on your employment-related compensation. So any training process and so on is paid for by ACC. It's not paid for by the employer. They've got someone there who's supported and trained. They don't have the financial responsibility until they can clearly see that they can do the job. And once you're trained into the job, then that's fine. And that you should be trained to whatever level is reasonable, not to a point that overloads yourself. Because remember, everything in life has to be in balance. It's not just about, can I go and work 30 hours a week or not? It's about, what can I do, under what circumstances, for how long, without disrupting balance across other aspects of my life. It's no good going to work and getting home so knackered that you forget how to wipe your bum and eat tea. That just doesn't help you or anyone. It just creates an extra burden.
With the autopilot aspect you just brought up, I had a psychologist in 2018, and she did come to me because I kept trying to do things on autopilot. And she pretty much said to me, it's like, get rid of that idea because you can't go on autopilot anymore. As I've just heard, that you can build up to it, but for the most part of it, with having the head injury, just to avoid thinking that I can do that on autopilot, and then that's made my life semi-easier
Yep.
to get through.
That's right, and that's where that other aspect, yeah, the errorless learning, but you also should combine that with the verbal mediation strategy that I talked about before. Remember, when we think, we put it into language. So alongside the doing this, you tell yourself what you're doing. So you've got a language that keeps you on track and keeps you moving through it, and you keep repeating that language time and time. So you've always got that cognitive, that thought structure that lets you manage and complete the task.
So what about kinesthetic learning? You know, from a learning point of view, using all the modalities of learning. When you're working with a brain injured, I'm just thinking of the things that I do with my son, that if I combine it on the 4 dimensions of modality, that would have a greater impact on the brain?
Often, yeah, then if you can create more than one pathway into the same system, it's going to stick better. It's just common sense, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, and yeah, so this is amazingly frustrating within relationships. It really annoys people that things don't get done. So again, it has to be focused on, looked at, and structures created that manage that. And yeah, and it's important to see also that this is completely independent of the task, of the skills that are required for completing the task. So you can be absolutely able to do whatever it is, but that's irrelevant to whether or not you actually think of doing it and putting it into action. And this is a problem again with assessment. Some people will assess you in a nice formalised office-based situation and see that you're capable of doing this. So then they start thinking, well, you're just being willful, you're not doing it, you really don't want to get better, you're just not engaging with this rehabilitation process. It's not that you won't, it's that you can't. And again, asking those questions and looking at that becomes so important, because then, you have to give structures, not for the task itself, the task skills, but rather for the motivation or the initiation pathways. Again, metacognition. Again, we keep on coming back to this because, if you can't self-reflect, you can't be self-aware. If you can't be self-aware, you can't know either what's going on for yourself or what's going on for other people that you have an impact on. Even if you can read what's going on with them, your theory of mind that we talked about before is better. You still don't see how that relationship process develops. So, and that becomes important too, because if you don't read yourself, you don't know. You don't know what you don't know. You haven't got knowledge of self. You don't see that there's any need to change. And this is what typically happens for teenagers when they have a brain injury. And they eventually do well physically, but often they get stuck still in that teenage brain. Well, I know it all. And so rather than sort of coming back and seeing mum and dad when you're 28 and think, oh, geez, Dad, you've learned a hell of a lot in the last 10 years. You knew nothing before. They get stuck there and they stay there and they never quite develop those skills. So again, you have to work with that. And again, I come back to that, it's having knowledge as opposed to being able to put that knowledge to action. Knowing something is not the same as using that knowledge in the real world. And
Sorry, did you just say if you had a head injury at 16 and you're now 33, can you get stuck in there?
You can get stuck as a 16-year-old, yeah. Not necessarily, but certainly it's very easy to have happen.
Why does that happen?
Because you just lose some of the ways that the brain then naturally breaks down connections and reforms those connections. A lot of those sort of upset teenage years are about connections in the brain breaking down and reforming and engaging in that whole synaptic plasticity process. And women, at 16 you'd be as a girl you'd be further along the track of getting that stuff completed than one of us blokes would be. Girls have usually completed that by sort of 18, 19, 20. Us blokes takes to a good 24, 25, 26 for that to happen.
What if you're 6? If you're 6 years old?
If you have an injury as a child, then the reality is that you're going to have more problems. There's this kind of myth that if you're young enough, then there's plenty of time for the brain development to take over and compensate for that. It doesn't work like that. You start by the curve and you lose more and more over time. The single most significant variable, for example, in people who don't have a job as a result of brain injury is that they had their injury before the age of 7 years. Tiredness. Again, this is a major killer. People just get knackered. And that it occurs particularly with mental activity. And remember, we talked about attention. Now, most people can compensate for problems with attention for a bit by putting more mental effort in for a period. But, sure.
See you later, cool.
Yeah, see ya. Yeah, thanks for coming. Joyce. So most people can compensate for that for a period by putting in more mental effort. But the cost of that is fatigue. You get knackered. So it's not going for the walk on the beach that tires you out. It's sitting down and doing the paperwork, reading a book, watching a TV program. Anything that involves mental activity tires you out more. And this is, again, one of those confusing things. You can be, someone looks at you in a relationship and they can see that you can go out and you can walk on the beach and, hey, you're walking on the beach, you're having a good time there, you're not getting tired, you're just complaining, you're just making it all up that you're knackered because I've just asked you to do the accounts for this week. But it happens. And it's a good clue that attention is a problem and you need to come back and look at that. And then again, you look at pills and potions to raise the threshold for what you can do. Yep. Okay, I'll just think there's only a couple more. I'll race through.
And remember that we will have a presentation available. It's a lot to take in, and so that is also an option. I don't think we're going to miss anything.
Question, so that, as you say, that frontal bit that gets cut out of your brain, if it does, it regrows, and then do you have to retrain yourself, or is that part of your loss?
You have to, and it may not fully regrow because we know that there are some bits of the brain where you can grow new cells, but that frontal bit is not really one of them. So usually if you lose a big chunk of frontal bit, that does leave you with some permanent problems. Doesn't mean you can't compensate for them and find ways of getting around that, and there are lots of strategies for that. But there are always going to be some things that you have to do with that. It won't just happen automatically. Okay. So, and again, that last one becomes really important. People see that the skills are retained and wonder why you're being so lazy and you're not doing stuff. They know you have the capacity to do it, but you just can't sustain the effort to do it. And that leads to obviously people becoming withdrawn, people become isolated. One of the big problems with overload is if you push people too hard to focus for too long and get too tired, they often end up like a stroppy, overtired 3-year-old. And those of you who had kids remember what that's like. They just get to that distraught, overwhelmed stage, but they just can't settle. And so you don't go to bed at night, you don't go to sleep. So you end up missing out on sleep, wake up tomorrow more tired because you're sleep deprived. And then you're into a vicious cycle that, if things getting worse and worse, the more tired you get, the more your cognition falls off, the more effort you've got to put in when you're awake to try and hold focus. So the tireder you get still, and that's when things really turn to custard. I see people have been in that kind of state for 2 or 3 years before they get to see me. And sometimes it's just a matter of stopping, backing up, having a week or two of sleeping tablets to catch up on sleep, re-examine the situation, then sort out what's actually going on and getting on top of it. And the communication one's obvious, and prosody, recognising, being able to have normal pitch and modulation in your voice. With someone who's just talking in an absolute monotone and doesn't have any pitch change. You don't know where they're coming from. You can't work out whether they're happy, excited, sad, what have you. That's using wrong words, having words coming out in the wrong order. But the most important thing is pragmatic skills. Just the real life process of getting your message across to other people, picking up on what their message is. And And that can become frustrating. You know, if you constantly take 1,000 words where really it just takes a sentence or two, then you piss people off usually. They stop listening to you, they see you coming and they go and hide behind the aspidistra. Because, it is frustrating. You know, they want to have the normal, concise, precise interactional processes. So, it's something that needs to be worked at. And, good speech language therapists are really good at dealing with those things and helping people with good skills around that. And what do we do to manage it? Well, it's really educate. People have to know. Let people understand why these things happen, where they come from, what's going on. And that involves partners, the kids, their parents, the employers, friends, workmates. My practice now, anyone that the person wants to bring along should be able to come along and be part of a meeting so that they can be taught and understand what's going on, how they can deal with it. Doesn't happen anywhere near as much. And of course, treat the underlying symptoms. We've talked about enough of those things, so I won't worry about that. And I'll stop talking at that point.
Comments and questions? Please feel free.
Well, please join me in thanking Gil for
It's been a pleasure.
Now, I know you're a thinker connoisseur, and I have to acknowledge Lima's very appreciative generative voices
Oh, wonderful.
of his wine.
All magnificent.
Yes,
Wonderful.
thank you so much, Lima.
Thank you.
And
Yes, an old definition of an alcoholic is someone who drinks more than their doctor, so most of my patients are safe.
very good. So